Just because you've mastered one martial art doesn't mean that those skills are always going to translate well in a mixed martial arts setting. The days of being a one-trick pony in MMA are long gone. We're not in the 90s anymore, where you'd be hard-pressed to find well-rounded MMA fighters that could do it all. The pioneers of the sport, like Royce Gracie, were able to use one martial art to dominate their competition. But today, one-dimensional fighters are weeded out. High-level fighters that can mix it up simply don't care about your past jiu-jitsu competitions or that Golden Gloves trophy. All that being said, there are some modern-day fighters that have used their original martial art to absolutely dominate their competition in the octagon. And when fighters can tailor their mastered martial art towards MMA, it's a thing of beauty. So today, I want to discuss some of the best representatives of individual martial arts in MMA. Karate. We usually don't think of karate when we're discussing some of the more fearsome combat sports. That's the one where the guys wear pajamas and say hi-ya. Karate gets a bad rep, namely due to the widespread belief that karate is too outdated for fighting. And there is some truth to this. A lot of techniques in karate are not practical in a real fight. Another point being that karate practitioners lack the toughness and aggression to succeed in the octagon. Tell someone you do karate and they'll probably think you're a softie. But Stephen Wonderboy Thompson puts this latter claim to bed. This guy is literally one of the greatest strikers in MMA history and has an undefeated kickboxing record of 37-0. Stephen Thompson's the nice guy of the MMA world. He's not your average rough-necked, cauliflower ear-having bull that we're accustomed to seeing in MMA. I mean, for God's sakes, the guy looks like a choir boy. So it's pretty ironic that Mr. Smiley Pants over here, Stephen Thompson, is repping karate. Some may be fooled by his friendly demeanor, but it's all fun and games until the back of this guy's heel is crashing into your jaw. Thompson started training under his father at the age of 3. His dad, a former kickboxer, owned a karate school in South Carolina. But when I say that he's one of the best strikers in MMA history, there's no need to mince words. He fucks everybody up. Stephen Thompson fights like someone in a movie. He's flashy. The guy uses all the techniques your coaches warn you not to because 99% of guys using those moves would gas out and leave themselves open for counters. Thompson, on the other hand, makes it all work in real life against modern day killers in the octagon. The guy moves like a fucking snake and keeps a traditional karate stance, which allows him to control distance and fire off kicks at the speed of light. He's always moving, always bouncing, and instead of measuring distance with his jab like most guys, he does it with his kicks. There's a certain superiority to some of his techniques, almost like you're watching a movie's main character finally use a move that trumps all other moves against his final opponent. It's almost impossible for his opponents to prepare for this awkward style because this guy's been practicing kickboxing and karate since he was a toddler. Fear not the man that practiced 10,000 kicks, but the one who practices a kick 10,000 times. And in Thompson's case, he's had over 30 years to throw kicks. That's why he's able to use those flashy, spinny wheel kicks and question mark kicks effectively, because he's absolutely mastered them. But it's not only his flashy karate style alone that makes him so good. It's his ability to mix his karate with the fundamental concepts of MMA.
Why do you think people are dismissive of karate?
Well, I mean, traditional karate, there's a lot of schools out there who kind of made us look bad. Just, saying they're this and they're that, and really they're like a blue belt, you know what I mean? I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, you saw a lot of that. You got to step out there and diverse yourself in other arts. And
some of his most impressive techniques is a lead side kick to the body. This attack really shows you how great he is because there's literally no telegraphing. It's also a reminder to his opponents that at any moment they can be sent on their ass. Thompson is a phenomenal representation of karate in MMA. Boxing. Boxing is a rough sport, often taken up by poor kids in gritty areas. It's such a fundamental part of fighting. But we've seen some high-level boxers cross into MMA, and it didn't go over so well for them, like James Toney, who got his ass handed to him by Randy Couture. There are some exceptions to the rule. Enter Petr Yan, nicknamed No Mercy. who many people believe to be one of the most skilled mixed martial artists to ever live. The guy is a machine. Petr Yan grew up in the Siberian region of Russia in a small town called Dudinka. Yan took to violence early on in life. From the age of 6, his parents were getting calls from Yan's school reporting that he was getting into multiple fights per day. To let him channel his aggression in a positive way, they introduced him to sport, but it wasn't until he was 11 in which he was introduced to boxing. Petr's older brother was boxing at the time, and in an interview, Yan said that he became envious seeing the beaten up, tortured appearance of his brother. He wanted to experience the same thing. No wonder he happens to be one of the most vicious, stone-cold killers in the octagon. This man was destined to be a fighter, and within 2 weeks of training, Petr jumped into competition and won. Fast forward 8 years, and Petr had achieved the rank of Master of Sport in boxing. Yan transitioned to MMA in 2014 and made his UFC debut in 2018. Although he's made plenty of adjustments to become a well-rounded mixed martial artist, his boxing background is so evident. He stands with a high guard, chin tucked, has phenomenal head movement, effortless counters, and makes it incredibly difficult for his opponents to hit him cleanly. He's known for being a slow starter though, and often feels his opponents out, throwing seldom body kicks and right hands just to gather some information on how they'll react. But don't let his early rounds fool you. When this guy gets going, it's like an avalanche. As the rounds increase, so does his volume. And when this guy lets his hands go, it's a sight to behold. He has the fastest hands in MMA, and his ability to counter is out of this world. The guy's a savant, a tactician. He's also got this mean and nasty look, and you can tell that this guy is cold as fucking ice from years of working on shipyards and boxing in gritty Soviet-style gyms. A fight for Petr is just another day in the office. He has completely outclassed some of the highest level strikers in his bantamweight division, which is probably the most stacked division that there is skill-wise in the UFC. His fight with Jose Aldo was incredible, and personally is my favorite UFC fight of all time. You rarely see guys going to the body and hitting each other with free-flowing combinations, but this fight with Jose Aldo, it had it all. For 4 rounds, you get to see some of the most beautiful displays of striking in MMA. Jan's performance against Sandhagen was also just as impressive. Sandhagen's one of the best modern-day strikers, and in typical Petr Yan fashion, Petr lost the first round, getting out-jabbed and held at a distance. But as the fight progressed, Jan's hands proved to be too much for Sandhagen. Even a guy like Corey Sandhagen, who's much taller and longer, has a longer reach, had absolutely no answer. And there's just no way to evade this guy's speed and power. But Yan is also good everywhere else, and he's proven this against one of the best grapplers in the sport, Aljamain Sterling, who Yan took down 7 times in their first fight. And in their second fight, Yan stuffed 20 of Aljamain's 22 takedown attempts. The reason Petr is so dangerous with his boxing is because he's solid everywhere else, and when his opponents can't take him down, they have to stand with the juggernaut. And this guy's representation of boxing in MMA would make any boxer proud. Jiu Jitsu. Jiu Jitsu was the first martial art to dominate the MMA scene, and you've probably seen that clip of Ryan Hall getting chinned by Ilia Topuria earlier on in this video. The only one-dimensional jiu-jitsu fighter in the UFC that actually submits guys at a high level is Paul Craig, but even he pales in comparison to the best submission artist to ever grace the sport, Charles "Du Bronx" Oliveira. He's achieved such a high level of mastery over jiu-jitsu that it's truly remarkable. At just 33 years old, Charles Oliveira has the most submissions in UFC history at 16. And the craziest thing about this stat is that he leads the pack by a mile, and everybody else below him on the list is either retired or on the verge of retirement. And this dude isn't even close to being done with his career. Charles Oliveira was born into poverty in the favelas of Sao Paulo, Brazil. He originally wanted to play football, but due to severe injuries, he was forced to be bedridden. But at the age of 12, the resilient Charles recovered from his injuries, and his neighbor Paulo introduced him to jiu-jitsu. Charles's family was so poor that they funded his training by selling snacks on the street. But DuBronx had some serious talent, and when this guy was asked in an interview about when he knew that he had talent for jiu-jitsu, he said this.
Ele fala assim, caralho, sou foda no jiu-jitsu, assim, sou bom.
Campeonato Paulista, fechado, e eu fui campeão do fechado. Mês treinando.
This dude won a championship level tournament in Brazil after just 1 month of training. No wonder people were calling him the Golden Boy. In 2007, he transitioned to MMA, and by the age of 20, he made his UFC debut. His first 6 wins, all by submission. When I see Charles grapple, he looks like a fish in water, a bird in the sky. He is so fluid with his movement, and it's evident that he can anticipate his opponent's every move. Everything in his ground game is refined, and it's just second nature. Charles Oliveira looks more comfortable grappling than he would be just chilling and breathing. But what makes Charles so impressive is his ability to use his jiu-jitsu in an MMA setting effectively. He finishes so many people on the ground, and his submission offense is by far the best part of his game. Again, we've seen guys, even like Gilbert Burns, a high-level 80cc level fighter who transitioned to MMA and hasn't really dominated that many people on the ground. For sure, a guy like Gilbert Burns is phenomenal, but he took 4.5 years to finally get a submission at welterweight, and it was over Neil Magny. But we see a guy like Charles Oliveira that never competed in ADCC just come into MMA and wreck shop. So I truly rate this guy's jiu-jitsu higher than anyone else that we've ever seen, because when this guy gets fights to the ground, unless he's fighting a guy like Islam Makhachev, who is also like one of the best grapplers that we've ever seen in the sport of MMA, everyone is fucked. And that's just a fact. That's why this guy has so many goddamn finishes on the ground. He has long limbs, which allow for him to submit guys in many different ways. When he's on his back, he's able to wrap guys up with his legs. When faced with an aggressive opponent, he can wrap them up with guillotines, arm bars, triangles. He can lock up submissions from the most unorthodox positions, and he can chain them together effortlessly as well. There is nobody else that we've seen in MMA with the amount of offensive ground attacks that this guy has in his arsenal. And there's no one else in MMA that looks as comfortable as Charles Oliveira on the ground, which is why this guy is the best representation of jiu-jitsu in MMA. Judo. We don't usually get to see a lot of judo in MMA, and even when it's used, it kind of flies under the radar. Like with other great arts, we've seen some high-level judokas fail to implement their grappling in MMA. A great example of this being Casey Kenny, who is a 9-time national champion in judo that started training at the age of 5, but we rarely see this guy attempting any takedowns. But if we're to look at someone that has successfully implemented a judo-heavy style of offensive grappling in MMA, we can look at no other than Khabib Nurmagomedov. It's kind of impressive at how, although judo flies under the radar, the best representation of judo in MMA happens to be the second most famous MMA fighter to ever live. Judo, like karate, gets a bit of a bad rep. In judo schools, you have to use a gi, and in a fight, that just isn't always realistic, especially in MMA. But judo ain't all about grabbing on someone's clothes in order to take them to the ground. There are many effective ways to take people down in MMA with judo. Foot sweeps, inside trips, hip tosses. These are where most of Khabib's takedowns come from. Khabib grew up in Dagestan, where wrestling is the most highly regarded sport. However, in a video in which Khabib was surrounded with other MMA greats like Henry Cejudo, Kamaru Usman, and Frankie Edgar, Khabib spoke extremely highly about judo.
Please. For judo. Wow. Yes, brother. Freestyle like bulls, but judo is like high level.
I mean, for Khabib to tell former NCAA and Olympic wrestlers that judo is the most prestigious art goes to show how important it was to him. Even his father, Abdul Manap, said that he would have preferred Khabib to become a judoka. And although Khabib started wrestling from a very young age, his father wanted him to transition to judo at the age of 15. And this was difficult for Khabib at first, but his father wanted him to get used to training in a gi. What makes his judo so skilled is that he mixes it with his wrestling. Most of Khabib's opponents are training with high-level wrestlers. They're drilling single legs, double legs, body locks, but they're almost never prepared for the bag of judo tricks that Khabib has up his sleeve. Judo is all about using an aggressive opponent's momentum against them. One wrong move and you're falling to the mat. It's a game of millimeters. Now, wrestling is also an incredibly skilled art, but Khabib said it best. Wrestlers are like bulls. They use their grit, their physicality, their strength. Judo is all about finesse. Judo places a greater emphasis on technique. One of the things that makes Khabib so good is his ability not just to get takedowns, but to take his opponents down in such a way that renders them to be very weak once they hit the mat, basically putting them in some really bad positions where Khabib can tee off on them offensively with his ground and pound. His ability to do this comes from Judo, where the goal is to submit your opponents with a joint lock or a chokehold once they're on their back. This is why Khabib is one of the most ferocious grapplers in the world. When Khabib's opponents talked about what made him so good, they didn't allude to his strength. Instead, they brought up his technical ability. Like a Charles Oliveira, Khabib is just a step ahead of his opponents on the ground. He knows exactly what they're about to do before they do it. And this is the kind of skill and technical ability that is developed through years of high-level grappling. And without Judo, he probably wouldn't be nearly as effective in MMA. Kickboxing. Kickboxing and Muay Thai are pretty similar, and for the sake of making a video that isn't too long, I'm just going to cover one of them. Alex Pereira is the highest level of them all. He's a 2-weight division Glory Kickboxing champion and the current UFC middleweight champion, coming off of a knockout win over Israel Adesanya. But this isn't the guy that we're going to discuss. For as impressive as Alex Pereira is on the feet, he simply hasn't fought enough in MMA for us to consider him the best representative of a single martial art in MMA. For God's sakes, he just took the belt off of another former kickboxer, and he needs to prove himself a bit more against some other styles. It's because his emotes during his fights don't fool me into getting impressed with his 3 leg kicks at range and 2 jabs per round. Plus, his fights with mediocre competition are way too close for me to even consider him as being the best. Alexander Volkanovski is the highest level kickboxer that is currently in the UFC. This guy has dominated every single person that he's fought on the feet. And what's craziest about Alex is he didn't even start training martial arts until he was 22. Alex is a short guy, but he's built like a tank and as strong as an ox. He has a 72-inch reach at only 5'6", and in just 12 years, he went from being a novice to the highest level striker the MMA world has ever seen. A perfect example of his well-rounded striking game being his fights with Max Holloway. In his first fight with Max was a 4-time defending UFC featherweight champion who looked like he was on his way to becoming the featherweight GOAT, but Volkanovski shut him down completely. The story of this fight was the leg kicks. Volkanovski landed over 70 of them on Holloway, which completely took away his movement. Seeing Volk steal every single round off of Holloway, who was an absolute juggernaut, seemed almost unfathomable. Now, Max was known for being quote-unquote the best boxer in the UFC at the time, and after a closely contested rematch with Volk, in which Volk won again, Max put on one of the scariest performances ever over Calvin Kattar, in which Max Holloway broke the record for significant strikes with a total of 445. Max looked like a freaking Super Saiyan going into his trilogy with Volkanovski, but received a rude awakening, in which Volkanovski beat Max Holloway's ass for 5 rounds, this time almost entirely with his hands. We've never seen anyone outbox Holloway like that, and Volkanovski just completely changed his approach from their first fight. So what makes him so good on the feet? Well, firstly, Volkanovski never throws naked attacks. He always sets them up with feints, and he not only uses these feints to draw reactions out of his opponents, but to close the distance as well, and to move his opponents in the direction of where he can land big shots on them. He's constantly capitalizing off of his opponent's reactions to his feints, and he's able to do this with just one reaction from his opponents. But Volkanovski is hitting his opponents with everything in the kitchen sink. Volk loves to mix it up too. Volkanovski's kicking game may not be fancy, like he's not going to throw any head kicks or spinning wheel kicks, but he's extremely effective. And even against a guy like Islam Makhachev, Volkanovski landed more significant strikes on Islam than Islam's last 6 opponents combined. Islam Makhachev is statistically the hardest guy to hit in the UFC, and Volkanovski rendered him to a zombie by the time the fight ended. Nobody is skilled enough to get out of a Volkanovski fight unscathed. He's as high level as it gets and proves it when he's worlds ahead of the other legendary strikers that he fights. The skill gap is just too impressive to overlook. For that, Volkanovski is the best representative for kickboxing in MMA. Lastly, we're going to look at wrestling, which is one of the most important elements of MMA. The power to decide where the fight takes place, standing or grappling. That always gives someone an advantage. And we've seen so many high-level wrestlers in MMA, but I'm looking for someone that uses it often to win his fights. Enter Georges St-Pierre. I believe that he is the best pure MMA wrestler that we've ever seen. Georges St-Pierre not only has the most takedowns in UFC history, but also the most control time as well. He also has one of the most impressive takedown accuracy stats, being 73%, which is unheard of for someone as active with their offensive wrestling in MMA like a GSP. George grew up in Montreal, Canada, and took up karate as his first martial art. But when George was 16, his karate instructor died, and he decided to take up wrestling and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. But what's really impressive about George is that he didn't compete in any high level of wrestling. He's sort of like an Alexander Volkanovski that just picked things up as an adult. And there's a few things that makes George really successful with his wrestling and MMA. Number 1, the karate blitz timing and speed.
People think it's my wrestling that give me those takedowns. It's karate. And the drills that I do, the drills that I repeat.
Blitz.
And yes.
George's karate background allowed for him to efficiently close the distance with a blitz, which would put him in a good range to level change. Damn, I'm really making one hell of a case for karate being successful in MMA in this video. Another thing that made GSP really successful, and it cannot be overlooked, is that he did train quite a lot with Canada's Olympic wrestling team. And he would drive 6 hours from Montreal to New York City when he was younger to train at Renzo Gracie's BJJ on the weekends. GSP is also just a phenomenal athlete. He's always training and staying in shape, and since conditioning and strength is really important in wrestling, no wonder this guy's a fucking freak when it comes to taking guys down. Although George may not be able to win an Olympic gold in wrestling, in an MMA setting, he could probably take down some of the highest credentialed wrestlers and make it look effortless too. And this is just what it means to successfully implement an art into MMA. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. To keep your plan intact after getting punched, that is what MMA is all about.